Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's long-range forecast video brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. This analysis is being provided for perspective only, and any decision made based upon this presentation is the sole responsibility of the person making the decision. Finally, please remember that all long-range weather forecasting is speculative by nature. Well, I want to take a look here at the next 7 days here. So our next week, looking at the operational European model run here, looking at precipitation anomalies. And when we just zoom in here across the United States, we're going to see that really it's going to be the southeast and parts of the west and Pacific Northwest that are going to be kind of under the gun for much wetter than average conditions. And the reason why the midsection of the country is getting a bit of a break overall in these, and what has been a very active pattern, has been due to the change in the flow of the jet stream. So we're looking here at what the jet stream is going to look like on the 21st of December. So this will be our winter solstice. And overall what we see is a deeper trough that's sitting here off the west coast, and you can see the push of moisture that will be coming in because of that. The broader ridge that's extending over the midsection of the country with a little cutoff low that's moving here at the end of this week and this weekend over the southeast. And this is the one I'm most concerned about, at least for the southeast right now, because as this system comes through here, it will have no trouble tapping into a lot of Gulf moisture. We could really see precipitation amounts crank up ahead of this. And again, this is a Saturday, Sunday, Monday event. So if we just take a look at what I'm anticipating during that time period here, this shows us total accumulated precipitation. Again, we're looking at Saturday, but mostly Sunday and Monday. Down here as this low emerges here in the Gulf Coast states. And the potential is for some very strong winds as that low kind of shows up right in through here and slowly tracks over toward Florida again this weekend. And we could be seeing some rainfall amounts here. I mean, the models are not shy on bringing in some heavy rain into parts of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and even over into South Carolina, and of course into Florida. But we're going to have to watch to see where the heaviest rain bands do come around. Again, it's going to be a trajectory doing something like this, bringing in that very heavy rainfall in here into parts of Georgia. So we're going to watch out for that because this could be a very wet situation. Meanwhile, look, if you get up here into parts of the Mid-South, getting up into the eastern Corn Belt, very dry through the next week here. Look at Illinois, Missouri. If we come back over here to the west, we can kind of complete that picture. Notice that we're still not seeing more precip over in this area, but because of that deeper trough that's sitting there off the coast as a part of that, what we call negative PNA pattern, we are really going to be bringing in the moisture in from this direction, and the potential exists for Northern California, getting up into coastal Oregon and Washington to really crank up the precipitation amounts. Now you notice that as you get over here into the Intermountain West, that because of the trajectory of these systems, in other words, having to go over the Sierra Nevada and then over the Cascade Mountains, that we're drier here in the Rocky Mountains. Remember, our big Rocky Mountain snows typically come from a little bit more of a northwest trajectory on that flow. So where are we adding up the snow? It's going to be in the Cascade Mountains and in the mountain ranges in northern parts of California that are really going to be getting the brunt of the snow. I think snow elevation levels in the Cascades in Oregon and Washington, I've heard a lot of discussion about 3,000 to 3,500 feet. Above that, we could expect to see 3 to 5 feet of snow in some locations. And this is the region that desperately needs it. Of the whole of our western mountain ranges, it is Oregon and Washington's mountain ranges that are still behind average on total snow water content at this time of year. So this is a welcome sign for this region, as the beginning of the wet season has been quite dry in parts of the Pacific Northwest. Now, as we stretch it out, just to kind of give you an update on the warmth that's coming under that ridge. So remember, the flow pattern's doing something like this, with the cutoff low moving over in this direction over the weekend. Well, as you get into next week, this is valid on the afternoon, Tuesday afternoon here on Christmas Eve. We can see that under that ridge, quite a bit of warmth here spreading across the eastern half of the country, with some locations seeing temperature anomalies that'll be maybe 15 plus degrees warmer than average. And on Christmas Day, this is how things look like in the eastern half of the country in terms of temperature anomalies. So we're looking at a warm Christmas for the midsection of the U.S. and parts of the Canadian prairies here, with cooler weather and unsettled weather out west, which is what we just saw. But to make sure we keep this in perspective, I know it looks really warm, but remember, it's always compared to average. So just taking a look here at what we're anticipating, on Christmas Eve in terms of temperature anomalies, and this kind of holds through on Christmas Day, not temperature anomalies, excuse me, actual temperatures forecast by the European model here. So again, this is Christmas Eve holding into Christmas Day. We see that temperatures, here are staying below freezing, but nice 60s and 70s down here from Texas all the way over to Virginia. And then even right here in the Midwest, we're seeing a lot of temperatures in the mid to upper 40s and maybe some 50s in some locations. Where's that cold air? Tucked away back here in that trough that's out in the western part of the United States. So I just thought I'd give you a quick update on what we're anticipating for next week. Now, with that warmth that's coming through, we do anticipate this snow, of course, to be melting here in the coming days. And again, this was this corridor right into here that saw at some locations over 8 inches of snow with the previous system. But the snowpack that's in place up here in the Dakotas, Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, it doesn't appear that we're going to be getting warm enough to really melt all of that away. And with how cold it has been in this area, with having such cold top 6-inch soil temperatures and with a foot of snow on top of it in some locations, I'm not too worried about bringing in enough warm air to completely start to melt this off such that we get a flooding problem, given the fact that there's about 2 inches of liquid equivalent in some of that snowpack there in parts of North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and even getting back over into parts of Montana. So if there's anything to watch in the near term, it's going to be the day after Christmas, so the 26th. I'm keeping a close eye right here on a system that could be emerging out of Colorado and then moving quickly on off to the north and east as we progress through the end of next week. So we're going to watch that carefully. And that's because the deeper trough that came into California will be ejecting here into the Central Plains. And as a result of that change in the position of that trough, look at week 2 precipitation anomalies. At this particular time, I'll show you the flow pattern in a few moments, we're going to be getting much more troughing that kind of sneaks out of the Four Corners states and gets into the central part of the United States. So again, this is that week on, week off stuff I've been talking about. We're now getting into the week off, that's the near term, but then after the 25th, getting to the beginning of the new year, it appears that this area is going back over into a wetter pattern, while the northwest dries out and potentially the southeast gets a little bit of a break in this as well. And here's the reason why. Check this out. This is now valid out the 0Z on the 28th, Saturday, the 28th. And what we get is a flow pattern that may have to do something a bit more like this. Now, the reason why this dries out the northwest, getting way out here in this 10-day forecast, is because the trajectory of the upper level winds is coming from the wrong direction. Whereas it's going to stay wet down here in Southern California, and these troughs that kind of emerge out of the Four Corner states into the South Central Plains tend to make for very active weather in this corridor, because that warmth that you see out here in the east, well, that's also advecting in quite a bit of moisture here under that ridge, and that's just a setup for a very active time period. But again, this is the week 2 forecast we're talking about here. So let's see what this does to our temperatures. We certainly have the cooler bias that hangs on in this region over the next 5 days, simply due to the passage of these last 2 fronts and the cooler weather that's in place already. But as we get out here to days 5 through 10, you notice that at this point, this is where we have this situation setting up. Deeper trough here, broad ridge sitting over this area. Remember, we do have a little cutoff low that sneaks in through here, but overall, as we get into the week that kind of surrounds the Christmas holiday here, warmer than average conditions. But as we get out here toward the end of the month, this is where we see that trough really setting up shop here over the southwest. And even though you see the above average conditions here in the eastern half of the country, remember this will be transporting in quite a bit of moisture as well. And with the flow pattern doing this, that's going to set up for a very active and highly volatile pattern inside this region that I'm shading here. So that's our near term, getting us out to the beginning of January here in the United States and most of North America. Now, thinking about other places, I think our indicator on how the behavior is going on in the tropics is to take a look at this. You see, this is today's high temperature, so these have already happened here in Australia. Again, this is another record-setting day where we see most of the continent here with triple-digit heat, extreme heat. And why is this happening, and what does this tell us even about North American weather? Well, we've been talking about the Indian Ocean dipole since August. We know that it is now back into a position where it's matching the strength it had in August. And why that's important is we're going to be losing the Indian Ocean dipole as our dominant climate driver for our weather systems as we move into the month of January. We can see it right down here, all right? You see, going back in time, back to a month ago in November, this blue that you see in here indicates strong easterly winds leaving Australia and going over toward Africa. These reds indicate strong westerly winds leaving Australia going over toward, well, the Central Pacific. We see that with time we are losing those stronger easterly winds but maintaining a little bit of our westerly wind burst activity, which is why we're kind of faked out into thinking there's a little bit of an El Nino, and that's why our Southern Oscillation Index is still negative. But as we move forward, we can see that the upper levels of the atmosphere are kind of falling apart a little bit with that strong Indian Ocean dipole. While there is still sinking motion over this area and rising motion over this area, it is not nearly as strong as it had been in the last 3 months. So the Indian Ocean dipole is collapsing. Now let's translate this back to North American weather before I go back to the southern hemisphere. This is going to allow the Madden-Julian oscillation to more than likely become our most dominant tropical feature because of the lack of El Nino we have right now. So the MJO is probably going to be the more dominant feature. And what's important is it's been hanging out over here in phases 1 and 2 for so long that it's now forecast to come out here briefly into phase 3, go into the null phase, but possibly emerge somewhere in phases 6, 7, and 8. And if it does that and comes out, let's say in phase 7, and then comes out here and starts to move around, well, this would be very important for us in North America. Because when you think about phase 7 and phase 8, that tends to represent the development of deeper troughing, as you can see here, when we look at the lagged phase here with our 850 millibar temperature anomaly, so that's just above the surface, tends to say that we go back over into a cooler pattern once we get into the month of January. So we know that the finish of December is going to favor warmer than average conditions across the eastern 2/3 of the United States. What I'm telling you is with the crash of the Indian Ocean dipole and the MJO taking over, we are going to be more supportive of going back over into a colder pattern as we get into the month of January. Now, is there other support for this? Well, during the next 15 days or so, while much of the eastern part of the United States and North America goes over warm, look at where the cold is building. We see that it's building here in parts of Siberia and also over parts of Alaska. And why I'm talking about this is that, us meteorologists, we often refer to this region as the northern hemisphere's refrigerator. And we look for it as a storehouse for some of that colder air. Now, what I'm concerned about, again, thinking about that first week into January and the second week into January, is that while we build up that cold here at the end of December, if we continue to disrupt the polar vortex, elongating it again by the end of the month. So you can see here is the main lobe of the polar vortex, but it seems to be elongated like this. We're pinching in the warm air in the stratosphere here and there. We may finally get a polar vortex disruption that actually translates and communicates with the troposphere. That's the layer we live in, finally giving us the real shot at bringing in some very, very cold Arctic air. And my concern here is that we get some cross-polar flow, bringing that cold air from Siberia over the North Pole and into the eastern half of North America. We can start to see this by looking out here at the new European weekly forecast. We're looking at a time period of December 31st through January 1st. And you start to notice that at that time period, the colder spot in the northern hemisphere begins to invade here into Canada and into the western half of North America. So this implies some sort of a shift overall in where that colder air is going to be as we get into the month of January. And this may indicate some cold air outbreaks coming here for the eastern half of North America as we get into the month of January. Our other major global model we like to look at, the CFSV2, is on board with this. And I'll tell you, as that cranks up, you're going to see the jet stream doing this, splitting, going up into kind of Alaska and diving down like this with a strong subtropical branch coming through. And that tells me that as we get into the month of January, I'm going to watch this corridor to have a very, very active storm track. Now, that's climatologically consistent, but it's an extra factor we're going to be paying attention to. So, putting it all together, I think that the most important features moving into January is the warmth here, the warmth there, and the warmth in this area. I think that this is going to make the jet stream flow at times do something a bit more like this and like this. Our subtropical branch is that southern arrow, the polar branch being that northern arrow. And that may mean drier conditions as we get into January here out west and much more active in through this area. Again, that's climatologically consistent with the January pattern, but it's something this year I think is going to be aided by these warm ocean temperatures in both the Pacific and in the Atlantic. So we'll keep a close eye on that. Now, let's talk about South America as we finish up this video. Over the next 15 days, we're seeing that the eastern growing regions in Brazil are continuing to show up dry. So this would be like Bahia, Tocantins, Goiás, Minas Gerais, that area. We see wetter than average conditions up here in the Amazon and probably near normal precipitation Mato Grosso, Mato Grosso do Sul, with drier conditions down here in Rio Grande do Sul and Santa Catarina, I think is the name of that province just north of, or that state just north of there. Now, when we think about Brazil right now, remember that over the last 60 days, there is a bit of a deficit on the whole when looking at Brazil's major soybean growing areas. But there's actually been quite a bit of recent decent precipitation, and that's why the slope of this line here matches the slope of their normal rate. It was the drier time period in November here that got them off of normal in total of their Brazil's soybean growing area. Now, before I go any farther, I do want to say that the 15-day forecast is keeping Argentina's major soybean and corn growing corridor quite wet, with the surrounding area, that would be the western and southern regions, dry. Okay? Now, let's go beyond this and take a look at how things look from space. Now, just to make sure that we're clear on Brazil and Argentina's major soybean growing areas, I put the two production maps over there on the right. We can see that the regions that's not showing up as very healthy from space are Brazil's eastern growing regions, and also down here in Uruguay and Rio Grande do Sul. We can see that right in the center of Argentina, things look pretty good, especially compared to a year ago, but it has been less than ideal conditions north, west, and south around that corridor. Now, it's hard to use the Vegetation Health Index in through this area this time of year just due to too much cloud cover. So you have to be careful there in trying to interpret that image. But eastern Brazil, this area is shown up as the most stressed area. Okay. Now, what I want to show you here is that Brazil's best yielding years don't necessarily have an overly wet January. You can pause the video and take a look at the figure I have over here on the right. It shows Brazil's yield in red, their production in black, and their area planted in gray. And when we look at some of these higher yielding years, like these up here, oftentimes what is good about those years is they get the crop planted very early, and that's due to a lack of drought in August, September, and October. So because of that, they're trying to harvest these beans in January, which means they want it to be wet in very early January but dry at the end. Okay? Now, the 2019-2020 season, we had a later plant than a year ago. We have no large regions that are overly wet at this place, and as you saw, most regions actually have a 30 to 60-day deficit according to some of the CPC data. So we actually need normal to wetter than normal conditions in January for pod setting. So that's our backdrop here. So I did this. I went into the ERA 5 data and I reconstructed over the last about 40 years here what the Mato Grosso, so we're going to focus right in through here, what their January total precipitation looks like. Average is right here around 10, about around 10 inches, okay? So what we then did was we said, okay, sort those years and look for these wettest years versus the driest years, because we want to know how wet January is going to be for Brazil. And this is what we learned by looking at those wettest years. You see, the best configuration for having a wet January in and around Mato Grosso is to have El Nino-like westerly winds, like you see right in through here. We need to have the monsoonal circulation. Look at the black arrows I've indicated over here. We need to have a monsoonal circulation that comes in like this and turns in that direction. And then we need to have high pressure systems sitting over Argentina, bringing the flow around them like this. And that enhances, I know my drawing's getting a little busy here, but I'll do it in white. That enhances heavy precipitation right in through this corridor, okay? So again, we need the wet conditions in Brazil to make big yields this year. What does that do? Well, that really increases precipitable water in this corridor, giving us the necessary moisture we need to get a lot of heavy rainfall. Whenever that happens, it tends to be very dry down here in Brazil's southern grow regions. So think about Paraná or Rio Grande do Sul. Think of those two areas as being dry when Mato Grosso is wet. Now, is there a strong linkage to El Nino, La Nina? No, there isn't. But in general, warmer than normal conditions indicating a weak El Nino would be good for this. So we're talking only about Mato Grosso here. So here's what we know. With the MJO coming out eventually over here into phases probably 6, 7, and 8, those are phases, especially 7, 8, and if it comes around over into phase 1, that in the near term, in the beginning of January, could favor wetter conditions in Brazil. So the MJO coming out over there could favor those wetter conditions. We see that when we look out over the next month from the European weeklies, which were just released the other day, they are favoring wetter than average conditions here. But look at how wet things are going to be in northern and eastern Brazil according to the model, and drier conditions down here. Now, can you see how that's consistent with the picture that we just painted? If we're typically wet in this area, we're dry in Brazil's southern growing regions and also in parts of Argentina. And this is what the current long-range forecasts are picking up on. That's from the European over here on the left, the CFS V2 over here on the right. Very similar picture overall. Now, going beyond this, let me just show you one last figure. Looking only now at February, because we would want things to then dry out in February so that we could harvest this crop, which is technically on time compared to the last 5 years. In February, we're tending to keep this area very wet and parts of Mato Grosso. And if we need to be watching this, because if there's any delay in getting the soybeans out in Mato Grosso, it's going to delay safrinha corn planting, and that will be critical for safrinha corn. But here's the other thing. End of February, global models are also keeping Paraná and Rio Grande do Sul on the drier side of things. So at this point, what I'm seeing here in the models is we're looking at the potential for wetter January in parts of, well, northern and eastern growing regions, drier in southern. And this is less than ideal for the whole of the country to make huge yields, because we need to watch this area. This is a very productive region down here as potentially having some drier stresses during pod fill that could be critical for the health of the overall bean crop. And again, all of this culminates with the harvesting of the first crop and the planting of the second crop right up here, which is mostly a corn crop this time around. So we've got a lot to be watching here. Now that you know the background meteorology of what's driving things, both in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, we now have a better picture of what to be watching in each one of the forecast videos. Okay, a lot of great information. Hope you found it useful. I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.